It's almost like the gods were against you.
When the things happened that happened, I felt, goodness me, is this just doomed?
Did you cry when it came through that she was dead?
The sheer enormity
Overwhelmed
just
you?
suddenly overwhelmed me, and I was crying.
You know that lots of people speculated about you and Kwasi Kwarteng, your relationship with him, about your professional relationship with him. Some people suggested that you were closer to him than some people might have thought. Hello and welcome to a very special edition of The Reaction. Delighted to say I'm joined by Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, with her new book, 10 Years to Save the West. And we can get a first glimpse of it. Here it is,
Andrew.
Fascinating.
Here it is.
The first glimpse of the book, I guarantee it's going to go straight to the top of the bestsellers. Before we get into the politics in the book, Liz, I don't think I'll ever read another political book of this type which will have such a dramatic beginning because, of course, the start of your premiership, you went to see the Queen at Balmoral, following Boris Johnson, who was standing down. You were the Queen's last ever official engagement. What was it like?
Well, of course, at the time I didn't know that. I just knew that things weren't looking good, that we'd been scheduled to see the Queen at Buckingham Palace. It was then moved to Balmoral because she wasn't able to travel. And that was the first warning sign that all wasn't well. And that day, if you remember, it was an incredibly stormy day. It was driving rain. It was very, very hard for the plane to land. And the whole atmosphere was just, it felt very foreboding, actually.
And when you saw her, we've seen the photograph of her, looking immaculate, of course, but very frail. Did that sense of foreboding deepen?
Well, she was physically very frail, but mentally so alert. And I had no idea on that day that things were so imminent. I had no idea, because she was talking as if this was the start of something. That I was the new Prime Minister, that she'd be there giving me advice, sort of talking through the issues of the day. She was across everything. We had a very detailed chat for 20 minutes. She met my husband. You know, all of those things gave me no sense at all that her death was imminent. And she ended the meeting by saying, I look forward to seeing you again. So
you're then back in number 10. You make your speech, of course, you're the new Prime Minister. On the Wednesday, was it becoming clear that things were deteriorating in Balmoral? It
was, and I think the first really bad sign was when she wasn't able to come to the Privy Council. So I got there at 6 o'clock. This was we were in the Cobra room, which is under number 10.
Yeah.
All of the key people in the cabinet were lined up. Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House, we were ready to see the Queen on screen.
The new cabinet.
And then we got the message that that the meeting was cancelled, that it wouldn't be happening. And that was, of course, very, very worrying.
And I can still recall seeing in the Commons on Thursday, you were on the front bench, Nadhim Zahawi, who was the Tory party chairman, comes and sits next to you on the bench, and it's clearly a serious conversation, and you'd gone.
Yeah, and things were just clearly getting worse. And after what had happened at the Privy Council, I'd thought things are getting worse. This is not weeks away. This is potentially days away. And then when Nadhim came onto the front bench, I thought, this is hours. We're looking at hours here. And we'd just done a big announcement on energy, so my head was constantly switching between how do we deal with this immediate economic crisis we're facing versus, goodness me, the sheer enormity of our monarch who'd been on the throne for 70 years.
And it was going to be
for my entire life.
Yeah, and was going to be a great source of advice.
Absolutely.
And sagacity and wiseness for you.
Exactly. That was,
And then, of course...
And we were also having all the briefings with civil servants, so all of the briefings about what would happen, what the process would be, what the funeral would look like, all of those things as well. You
go back to number 10, you have to write a speech. You wrote it yourself.
Yes. They had a sort of a stock speech.
Sure.
And I did write it myself because it was just such a I wanted to say what I felt. I wanted to say what I felt and what I felt that everybody out there would be thinking at this, this terrible time.
Did you cry when it came through that she was dead?
No.
I did.
I didn't. Because I was so, at that point, I'd already been, appointing the new cabinet, doing the energy policy, thinking about what was ahead. I just had to get on with it. I had no even space to think about it.
No.
It was only at the weekend I was sitting on the sofa, I think,
with the family,
with the family, with my daughter, and it just the sheer enormity
overwhelmed you.
Just suddenly overwhelmed me, and I was crying.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did. And then, of course, it dominated everything.
Yes.
So we have this new Prime Minister. Who's she? Because all we're talking about is the preparations for the funeral, the first state funeral since Winston Churchill, and all the heads of states flying in. Did you have any chance to do the job of Prime Minister during those intervening days?
Well, we had to keep going because there are decisions that constantly need to be made. There were, if you remember at the time, Putin was issuing saber-rattling threats about nuclear, the use of nuclear force. So these things don't go away just because the tragic event had happened. So, of course, we had to carry on with the core business of government.
There's a point in there, I think you say in the book, why is this happening to me? I mean, I didn't sense for a second that you were feeling, poor me, but
it was just a sort of, the whole experience had been extremely surreal. The whole experience of running for the leadership, getting the job, the Queen dying, all came very, very fast, and it was a sort of constant train of events. So it felt surreal, very surreal.
Yeah, and of course the funeral went off beautifully, and then you can sort of get back to the day job. But I suspect during that time, were the plotters already working against you?
Well,
because there was a vacuum.
I didn't know what was going on, because not only was I doing all of the core prime ministerial duties, and there was a lot going on, as I said, on foreign affairs and what was happening with the war in Ukraine. But I had to prepare what we were actually going to do in office, because I made a lot of promises during the leadership election. I wanted to fulfil those promises. I felt it was urgent that we did that because things were not going well on the economy. It wasn't going well on the energy crisis. We had issues with immigration. All of those things had to be dealt with. And I just felt a real sense of the clock was ticking.
Yeah.
We only had 2 years towards the general election. And unless you take quick action, you don't start delivering for people. And what I've always had in politics is a sense that people understand, they read stuff in the media, they watch TV, but what really influences the way people vote is, how do I feel about my life? What bills am I paying? What opportunities do I have? Is my child getting a good education? Can I get a doctor's appointment? These are the kinds of things that people actually reflect on. And I thought, if we're going to turn that around, we need to act quickly. So that was what my 100% focus was on, is trying to get those things done. And just having been a minister for 10 years and knowing how bloody difficult it is to get stuff done, I was totally focused on that. So I didn't, and I think also as Prime Minister, you're quite isolated in number 10. You don't have that interaction. I'd had some problems with my phone. There was a fear my phone had been hacked. So I had a new phone, so I didn't necessarily have people's contact numbers. So I was quite cut off from what was going on.
Who hacked the phone? Michael Gove?
Well, I've got no idea who
the Russians
hacked my phone, but that was the suspicion.
That
was the suspicion, and in that circumstance, you have to give your phone over to security services. You can't do anything else. But it does. A combination of all those things meant that I was quite.
It was almost like the gods were against you. Must have felt.
Well,
like that.
I felt a sense of destiny. First of all, that I got the job in the first place, and what I needed to do. But also, when the things happened that happened, I felt goodness me, is this just
Yeah.
is this just doomed in some way?
Well, interesting. Now, you say very early in the book you were serving alongside people with differing priorities, but those ministers that you were serving with, that you appointed, or some of them you inherited, they knew what your priorities were. How did you sense that they weren't working with you? What were they? How did it manifest itself?
What I had was a real sense that if the situation was to be turned around, and I was particularly worried about the economic situation, the cost of living, the energy crisis, if we wanted to turn that around, we had to focus all of our energy on delivering. Mm-hmm. There wasn't time for the internal politicking. I assumed that my colleagues understood that. I assumed that they understood. I mean, to be clear, I hadn't wanted Boris to go. I thought it was a mistake. He was the leader that took us to an 80-seat majority. I think you have to have a very, very good reason for not having a leader in those circumstances. But given that he had gone, I felt we were in serious trouble and we all needed to pull together and we needed a bold plan to change what was happening. I don't think many of my colleagues necessarily agreed with that. And that became clear over time.
Let's talk about the title of the book, because it's 10 years to save the West. That's an apocalyptic title. What happens if we don't?
I think we've lost touch
Right.
with what has made our country successful,
Right.
and what has made our country great.
Yeah.
And we are, if you look at the number of people who are not in active employment, if you look at the degradation of basic facts about biology or our history that are being challenged every day, that shows to me
Is a man a man, or a woman
a society that's lost touch with what is important. And I'm a great believer in family. I think family is very important. I think our country is important and patriotism is important. And when I see people who claim to be ashamed of the British flag or ashamed, actively challenging basic tenets of, our history, saying that there's something shameful about being British, I think that is corrosive, and I think that is corroding our sense of identity, our sense as a country, our sense of society, and our economy as well. These things are all linked. I sometimes talk about wokenomics. We're excessively focused on things like net zero or diversity and inclusion. We don't seem to be focused enough on, is the country actually bringing in enough money so that people can enjoy a good life? And that, I know from talking to people on the doorstep all the time, they don't care about that stuff over there. What they care about is, can I and my family enjoy a good life? And I think we've lost touch with that. And this is not just a British problem. And this is why it's called 10 years to save the West, not 10 years to save Britain, because I see the same things happening in the United States. If you look at the extreme gender ideology stuff, it's even worse in America than it is in Britain.
But why did the British Conservative Party not embrace this and challenge it? You've got equalities ministers, this woke ideology, this obsession about trans issues when it's less than 1% of the population is trans, and yet we don't get clarity from the government about it.
Conservatives have been too afraid to take on the left-wing extremists. The Greta Thunbergs of this world who say we shouldn't burn oil and gas, even though that's exactly what China are doing, or the gender ideologists who say a trans woman is a woman, all of this stuff. And it's because it's not fashionable.
But
it's not fashionable.
But it's J.K. Rowling making this case, not a Conservative minister.
Well, Conservative ministers have made the case.
Not very loudly.
As when I was Women and Equality Minister, I stopped gender self-ID. So I did take a stand. I did stop this stuff. And what did I find? I got completely slagged off by everybody from Pink News to The Guardian.
Badge of honour.
And you have to take...
This
is the point. You have to take these people on. And you have to be prepared to be unpopular. Not be invited to trendy London dinner parties, slagged off by the establishment media. You have to be prepared. And not enough Conservatives have been prepared to do that.
I
That
agree.
is the bottom line.
Yeah.
And I think the other big issue, which I mention in my book, is we accepted the Blair inheritance back in 2005. You know, people talked about the heir to Blair. You know, Blair is the master, all this sort of stuff. And there was a whole coterie of these people in the Conservative Party. All of these things Blair did, the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act,
all still
the
there.
Climate Change Act,
All still there.
the Constitutional Reform Act. They all sound fluffy, don't they, Andrew?
No,
They all
not to
sound
me.
nice, but at the time,
Yeah.
people thought, oh, well, equality's nice.
Yeah, yeah.
Or isn't it nice that we care about climate change? Or, you know, we want to hug a husky or a hoodie or whatever it was. But the problem was that those changes Blair made have become embedded.
Yeah.
And now Conservatives don't control the institutions.
No.
The institutions are controlled by the left. So even if a government minister wants to change the policy, they can't. And that is where we are now.
Blair's last day as Prime Minister, David Cameron, as Leader of the Opposition, led Tory MPs in a standing ovation from him. I couldn't believe my ears or my eyes when I knew the damage he'd done to this country.
Well, you were very prescient, Andrew. And
Well, I
to
think
be honest,
a lot of people thought that. The Daily Mail was never a fan of what Tony Blair did to this country.
well, maybe I should have listened to the Daily Mail
You
more.
should have.
But when I went in as a new MP, because I was elected for the first time in 2010, I did not appreciate the level of damage that Blair had done. I came in, you know, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, thinking, oh no, this is normal politics, we can just change things. You know, we can make education more rigorous, you know, we can cut taxes, we can make the economy more efficient, we can control immigration. Let's just get on with it. We don't need to worry about the Equality Act or the Climate Change Act or the Constitutional Reform Act 2005. I now realise, having spent 10 years as government minister and become Prime Minister, that what Blair did, and the fact that we didn't just accept it, we actually embellished it. If you look at things like the Office of Budget Responsibility, which now runs Britain's tax policy.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not the Chancellor that sets Britain's tax policy, it's the Office
talk about that
of Budget
in a bit.
Responsibility. But I now realise that a straitjacket was created and it has become, frankly, too late for us to sort it out. And that is a huge problem for Conservatives.
You talked about Greta Thunberg earlier. You say in the book, on the environment, it was the single biggest loss to the left in 30 years, net zero. Can the clock be turned back?
Yes.
How?
Of course it can. Of course it can. Well, one of the things I tried to do as Prime Minister, which was not accepted by Conservative MPs, is get on with fracking.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that is the best thing we could do straight away to cut the price of energy. The US have half...
Yeah, but US has a lot more space in which to frack.
They've also got a lot more people.
Yeah.
There are estimates that show that if we got fracking going in the UK, we could become much more energy self-sufficient.
But it's the old problem of NIMBYism, isn't it? Not in my backyard. Oh, we can have some fracking, but not in this constituency.
Well, I think you need to make sure people are properly rewarded for fracking in their area. I think that's important. But it's also the environmental movement and the extreme environmental movement have made these things unacceptable.
Yeah.
So we're now putting huge windfall taxes on the North Sea that are stopping us properly exploiting oil and gas that could help make our energy cheaper. So we need to do all of those things. And so when you say, can we turn the tide? Yes, we can turn the tide. You know, I think a lot of the policies that Trump pursued in his first term turned the tide on some of that environmental legislation. That's what I think we need to do here in Britain.
You also talk about we've got to stand up to China, which is a bully, the world's biggest polluter. You use the expression we have levers at our disposal. What ones are they? How do we stop China polluting? Unless there's concerted, united action from every country.
That's why I say we should have concerted action. When the Soviet Union and China were on the rise in the 70s and 80s, the West got together and we agreed what technology we were willing to export to them, what investment we were willing to take from them. We could retaliate if we didn't like what they were doing. There's no such thing now. The West is not coordinated in taking on China in the way that we were coordinated in taking on the USSR. If you remember, Reagan called out the USSR as the evil empire. That's what we should be saying. These people are not our strategic partners. They are not our friends, Andrew.
But
they want to destroy our way of life.
I agree, I hear that. But one of the greatest champions of closer links with China in the last decade or so is now the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron. Not only did he make a lot of money while he was a backbencher, but when he was Prime Minister with George Osborne, promoted ever closer links with China. Who can forget the pub, the pint in the pub at Chequers?
I think all of us, and I do say this in my book, all of us wanted to believe that with greater economic development, with greater ties with the West, maybe China would change. But that has clearly not happened, and we now need to learn from that and see them for the threat they are. So the moment for me where it changed and I realised what threat China posed was when President Xi declared himself life president.
Yeah.
And I realised that this was not somebody on the path towards more freedom. This was somebody on the path to totalitarian dictatorship.
Yeah.
And certainly what I learnt as Foreign Secretary made me even more convinced of the absolute threat China poses. So even if we were naive, back in the 2000s, even if surely we must realise now.
Yeah.
Surely we must realise now. So we need to change that policy, and we need to be much clearer about the threat China poses. We need to be much more careful about what trade we're doing with China, what we allow ourselves to export to China, and we need to work very closely with the US and our other allies. My concern is that Biden is not doing enough on this. I mean, if you look at Janet Yellen, she's busy cozying up to China again. That's disgraceful. That's not acceptable. The US are still the leaders of the free world, and I think they are not showing leadership at all.
Let's digress briefly on America. We've got a presidential election coming up in November. Joe Biden, to me, clearly he's got cognitive issues apart from anything else. Are you rooting for a Trump victory?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, I am.
That's quite clear. Let's talk about the economy, because that's where your premiership founded. On day one, you were persuaded by your Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, to fire Tom Sculler, who was the most senior Mandarin at the Treasury. Was that a mistake?
I think we were in a bit of a catch-22 situation, to be frank. An impossible situation, as I would put it. We had a very powerful economic orthodoxy. And I'd actually talked about them during the leadership election, which probably didn't endear me to them.
Yeah.
But I'd talked about them during the leadership election. We had a Bank of England that Gordon Brown made more powerful with his act. We had the Treasury itself, and Tom Sculler had been there for many, many years, promulgating the types of policies that were a concern. And then we had the OBR, which was yet another
Office of Budget Responsibility, created by, of course, George Osborne.
Created by George Osborne, but embedded with the same Treasury ideology. And just to be clear about what this ideology is. First of all, they believe very strongly in remaining close to the EU.
Yeah.
They don't want to get rid of EU law. They want to remain aligned. They believe in high regulation. They believe in high taxation. And they also believe in high immigration. All of these things are embedded into the economic model that the OBR has and the views that the Treasury have. That is crucial, and I recognise that. I was Chief Secretary for 2 years. I'd seen the way they operated, and I thought we needed to change things, but I ran on that.
On day one, you sacked the Permanent Secretary. Go back to the question, was it a mistake?
I think if we hadn't, it would have been very difficult to get our mini budget through.
Okay.
But I agree that it set all sorts of hairs running.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to do.
They were always going to come after you after that.
Well, I think they were coming after me anyway.
Yeah, but that But this is day one. But were you persuaded to do this against your better instincts by your Chancellor?
I wouldn't say that. I don't think that's fair. I think it was. But if it was very much. I felt Kwasi needed to be able to run the Treasury as he saw fit to deliver the policies, and also in principle, Andrew.
Yeah.
I believe that any Secretary of State of any department should be able to choose a permanent secretary they're comfortable with.
I get that.
Otherwise, who is running the country?
I get that. But then the book makes clear that you were stopped from appointing his successor. Now, you haven't told us who that successor is in the book. So you dismiss the top dog, but you don't have a replacement ready to walk through the Treasury the same day. And when you try and appoint this person, him or her, who I assume was outside the Whitehall machine, maybe I'm wrong.
That's a wrong assumption.
Okay, wrong assumption. Okay, somebody within the Whitehall machine, you're blocked. How can a Prime Minister be blocked from appointing a civil servant to the top job at the Treasury? How does that happen?
So Kwasi did know who he wanted to appoint. And he knew that
and
on
you
day
knew who it was.
He knew that on day one.
Yeah. And
so
did you agree with his choice?
Yes, but I also agreed with the point that he was the Chancellor and he should make a decision about who he was comfortable working with.
Yeah.
I think that was important. We wanted to change the way the Treasury operated.
Yeah.
The Treasury and its worldview is one of the main problems we have had as a country in delivering the opportunities of Brexit. From day one, and I watched this from 2016, from day one they have foot dragged, they have sabotaged the delivery of the type of policy we need to make the British economy successful after Brexit. That is their house view.
Yeah.
And unless we did something about them, I felt it would be difficult to deliver those policies within 2 years. So that's the reality of the situation, Andrew. But in terms of the process, the process for appointing civil servants is quite complicated and it is quite time-consuming, and I don't think it works. I don't think it works.
It clearly doesn't, because you didn't succeed. You weren't able.
Well, the specific issue in this case is we were threatened that it would be market destabilising.
Yes. And who did make that threat to you? Was that the governor of the Bank of England?
Well, the implication was it was the governor of the Bank of England.
Andrew Bailey.
Yes. That was the implication.
And who told?
I didn't speak to him directly.
But the implication came from where?
It came from senior civil servants.
So they said, if you do this, market instability.
Correct.
So you blinked.
Yes.
Do you regret that?
No. The reason I blinked is because, if you remember this was after the mini budget.
Yeah.
Before the mini budget, we were given no warning that there was an issue with LDIs. These investments pension funds made that were highly, they were called liability-driven investments, but they were highly susceptible to changes in the interest rate. So we hadn't realised there was a tinderbox that could potentially blow up if a significant economic change were made. So when the mini budget was delivered, and it was delivered the day after the Bank of England governor didn't put up interest rates as much as expected, and also the Bank of England governor announced that there would be a sale of gilts, i.e. government bonds. So what happened is, unbeknownst to us, we had launched the mini budget in a very fragile financial situation. And that created an issue with the markets. So if you think about it, I'd been in this situation before where we hadn't been warned that something like that could happen because of the very fragile situation in the markets. I was then once bitten, twice shy about anything that could create market jitters. That was the issue. And so I thought it was a credible threat.
Right.
I thought it was a credible threat because what I'd seen after the whole issue with the mini budget and the LDIs and the fact the Bank of England governor hadn't put up interest rates much, I'd seen the reaction from the market, and I'd seen the impact the Bank of England governor's statements had, which hadn't been particularly supportive of the government. I'd seen the impact those statements had. So I thought it was a credible threat. That is the issue, Andrew.
So, and you've got Tom Scholar outside causing trouble from the outside, because I'm pretty sure he was talking to the International Monetary Fund, who took the unusual step of attacking your mini budget. You've got the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case. You're very critical of him in the book. You effectively say he was trying to bring you down.
I don't say that.
No,
what I
but
say,
you say he's causing a lot of trouble.
What I say is that, during that time, first of all, Kwasi and I weren't cited on this LDI issue, which was unique to Britain.
Yeah, and it was deliberate.
We had 60% of the global market in these LDIs. They were a risky investment because everybody knew interest rates were going to go up. Interest rates were going up in America, they were going up in Europe, they were going up in Japan. We weren't told about that. So when there was a problem on the markets, the Monday after the Friday of the mini-budget, we were totally blindsided.
And they didn't tell you, do you think that was because they were trying to scupper you? What else? What other reason? Because it's their job to tell you.
I don't know whether it was poor communication between the Bank of England and the Treasury. I don't know the issue was.
What's your gut instinct?
My instinct is very much that the economic establishment did not want to be helpful. That they fundamentally didn't like the policies. They didn't want to diverge from EU regulation. They didn't want to cut taxes. They didn't really want to cut the size of government, which I think is very important. And they definitely didn't want to cut immigration. So, they didn't like our policies.
They didn't like the Chancellor much either, did they?
Now, all I can tell you is it felt like we weren't getting the fulsome support of the Bank of England for what we were trying to do.
Did you feel at times like you were not so much as treading water, almost drowning?
I felt that there was a lack of support for what we were trying to do. I put it like that.
If you'd had a more experienced Chancellor, would it have made a difference? Because he'd never been a Treasury Minister.
The point I make about Kwasi is that he believed in the policies.
Yeah.
And that was really important.
Yeah,
and we've talked before about how many Conservatives in the Conservative Party actually agree and believe in and are prepared to advocate Conservative policies. And he was one that was prepared to advocate those policies. And I'd seen him with Boris Johnson saying that raising corporation tax was a mistake. He'd talked to Boris about how we shouldn't be levying windfall taxes. He was very much aligned to the agenda. Did he get everything right? Possibly not.
You know that lots of people speculated about you and Kwasi Kwarteng, your relationship with him, about your professional relationship with him. Some people suggested that you were closer to him than some people might have thought. Did you heard those rumours?
He's a close friend of mine.
That's it.
That's it.
Yeah. So you've got the Treasury establishment fighting you, but Governor of the Bank of England. You got rid of Tom Scholar, his allies are getting you. You won the support of the party membership, but you didn't have a huge mandate from Tory MPs. And if you talk to some MPs now, they say she should have worked harder with us to take us with her.
I've kind of thought through what could I have done differently. It's a question people ask me a lot. And apart from saying maybe not run for leadership on a bold manifesto that turned out we weren't able to deliver, I don't think having more drinks with MPs would have really been the decisive factor, Andrew.
Perhaps you should have got rid of the Governor of the Bank of England. Although I think you have to point out that he's mentally unstable to get rid of the Governor of the Bank. It's very difficult to get rid of a Governor of the Bank of England. But he was no fan of yours.
No, but we consciously thought about all of these things beforehand.
I said it to one of your advisors. He said, what should you do on day one? I said, day one, get rid of the Governor of the Bank of England.
So first of all, the Prime Minister can't sack the Governor of the Bank of England. We would have, I guess you could have had a conversation saying, I'm not very happy with you, please will you leave?
Yeah.
But can you imagine the furore that would have created?
Thatcher got rid of one.
But that was before the Bank of England. That was before the Bank of England Act. You see, this is what I'm overall saying is that I don't believe that the way the state is currently constituted, the way that all of these quangos have been established, and I include the Bank of England and the OBR in that, I don't believe it's possible to deliver those Conservative policies without changing that stuff first.
Yeah.
And that's the real message from my book, is I want people to read it and understand just how difficult we have made it to deliver Conservative policies, because all of these institutions have been influenced and
Yeah.
by the left.
So
that's the bottom line.
We get that, but the title of the book is 10 Years to Save the West. If you were to articulate in a few sentences how you're going to do that, how do you save the West? I mean, you've got some policy ideas in there, vouchers for schools. That's not going to save the West. How are you going to save the West?
Well, first of all, Conservatives need to be brave and be prepared to take on the left on all of the key issues. Net zero, immigration, the size of government and tax and spend and wokery. And we need to be prepared to change the institutions. So that's the first thing you've got to do, is you've got to be real Conservatives and you've got to change the institutions.
Yeah.
And then you have to deliver the policies.
Yeah.
And the first thing we have to recognise as Conservatives is we're not going to be able to deliver our policies unless we change the institutions. So we've got to sort out the Bank of England. We've got to sort out the Constitutional Reform Act and the judiciary. We've got to sort out all of those things in order to be able to deliver Conservative policies.
Yeah.
That's how difficult it is. That's how treacle-like it's got in government.
And in fact, you're very rude about the Supreme Court in there, which was, of course, another creation of Tony Blair's.
Well, people talk about leaving the ECHR in order to deal with immigration. That is not enough. Because even if we left the ECHR, if we still have our current judicial and legal structure in Britain, with the lefty lawyers running the show, we are not going to be able to deal with the immigration problem.
No. And are you taking us out of the ECHR?
I believe we should leave the ECHR, yes.
Yeah. Well, should that be in the Tory manifesto?
Yes.
Could
But
be.
it's not good enough on its own.
I get
because
that.
the lesson of leaving the EU, Andrew, is that leaving the EU was not enough if we're not going to change the British institutions who all have that mindset. You know, the Treasury being the primary example, the Foreign Office is another example. It's not enough.
What about also some fascinating stuff personally for you in number 10, how surprised you were. I was very struck by you said how outraged you were that Boris Johnson, he could have died of COVID. And as you make the point that if that had been in the United States, the President would have 20 doctors looking after him. Boris had one. We were all quite struck by the fact you had to make your own appointments to get your hair done. I mean, can you imagine Macron in the Élysée Palace where they've got liveried uniformed staff? Is the Office of Prime Minister just too cheapskate in this country, too scaled back?
It's the whole organisation of number 10, the Prime Ministerial Office, what the expectations of the Prime Minister, in my view, don't work. They don't work, and there should be more support for the Prime Minister. I mean, I thought the whole situation with Boris was appalling, where he was allowed to or expected to fend for himself in a flat, almost died. It would never happen with the leader of the other country. So we've got this issue that there are expectations that the British Prime Minister is effectively acts a bit like the American president, but they don't have anything like the level of support and ability to actually do that.
Was there a Paul on the road to Damascus moment when you thought, it's not happening? I know you talked to Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 22, and you said, is it recoverable, the position? What was I know your husband Hugh was very important in all of this, your lodestar, as you describe him in the book.
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, first of all, he told me that the job was doomed before I even
know,
ran for it.
I know
so
he did.
He proved to be right.
He's Mystic Meg.
Right, exactly. He needs to get a column, doesn't he?
Yeah.
But I think it was after that I was forced to do the U-turns on the corporation tax. I thought, well,
top rate of tax.
You know, I'm being not the top rate. I think I could have lived with that. I didn't like the fact we had to reverse that, but I could have lived with that. It was changing the whole mini budget plan, which I had been elected on as Conservative Party leader. I'd got a mandate from Conservative members. It was a reflection of what was in the 2019 manifesto, which is we said we weren't going to raise taxes.
Yeah.
The fact that I wasn't able to deliver that the OBR forecast had been leaked.
Yeah.
Who by question mark. The fact that effectively the Bank of England governor was warning that if I didn't U-turn, the market, you know.
Yeah, interest
That
rates
was
had gone
not
up.
being able to deliver the key planks of my policy.
But was there a point when you were at home, just over a glass of wine with Hugh, when you realised? I remember if it's in the Downing Street flat when Dennis Thatcher apparently said to Mrs Thatcher, "Darling, it's over. Don't be humiliated. Go out and resign in your terms."
He said to me...
this is Hugh, your husband.
This is Hugh, yeah. He said to me, we were at Chequers, and this was talking about... This was after the reversal on the policies. We were talking about, you know, what dreadful policy changes were going to have to be made to fit the OBR straitjacket. And he just said to me, is there any point in you being here if you can't deliver what you care about?
You had 49 days. Are you sometimes embarrassed that you're going to go down in history as the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history? Probably nobody's ever going to do fewer days. Or are you proud you got there?
I'm not embarrassed. I'm definitely frustrated that I feel we've missed an opportunity to deliver those policies. Am I proud to have got there? I'm proud that when I got there, I did actually get rid of a tax. So I got rid of this new health and social care levy that had been put on by Rishi Sunak. So that British taxpayers are no longer having to pay the tax. That's the achievement I'm proud of.
One achievement.
In the office. Well,
one achievement.
I think there aren't very many Conservative Prime Ministers recently who've actually lowered the tax burden.
No.
And I'm the only one of them. So that's what I care about. I care about what did I actually do.
The book, what next? Another book? You've got your low growth, you've got your commission?
Yes, Growth Commission.
We've
got Popular Conservatives,
yeah,
which is
all
about making the case.
Do you see a Tory leader among them?
This is about creating a movement of people who believe in popular Conservative policies.
Right.
You know, low taxes, control on our borders and proper restrictions, who believe in not going along with all the net zero extremists, who believe that men are men and women are women.
Unlike the Labour leader.
A controversial view in our day. And what I experienced at Number 10 was and I speak to, I go canvassing, I speak to a lot of members of the public. A lot of people say to me that they believe I was right and they believe I was stitched up.
Yeah.
So that is, but what we don't have is a sort of a movement that is actually promoting these ideas so that when the lefty Twitter sphere goes mad, or when the Guardian and the BBC put up a fake fact check or whatever they do, we don't have the people who are prepared to make the arguments, and that's what I think is needed on the right of politics. So I think, look, there are lots of great people in the Conservative Party. I'm not going to run a book on the future Conservative leader. But it's not good enough just to have one person who's good.
Yeah.
That's the lesson. If there's any lesson from Thatcherism, there were people like Keith Joseph, there was John Biffen, there were the IEA at the time. There were all of these people advocating these ideas long in advance. And I didn't have the run up for that. No, I didn't. We only had 2 years, and maybe it was just too difficult. There's one person who was at the Modern Conservatives launch, and you were at his 60th birthday party last week, Nigel Farage. He's been making the sort of case you've been making, certainly on immigration and links with the EU and Europe. He hasn't got a job at the moment. After the election, shouldn't the Tory party and the Modern Conservatives find a role for that man? Well, I've said that he should join the Conservative Party, and I think the Prime Minister said he's open to that.
Yeah. Did you believe that? I didn't. But he won't be leaving the Tory party for much longer, Liz Truss. But after the election, if the scale of the defeat is as bad as it is, shouldn't the Tory party think about talking to some of the people in reform?
The absolute key thing,
Nigel Farage.
I keep coming back to this, and I know you're a journalist. You love talking about personalities. You love gossip.
You mentioned that in the book.
Who's doing what with who? All this sort of stuff. But to me, unless you have enough people that believe in changing things. And people have to realise, and this is what the book is about, that it's not good enough just to get the position and have the policies when you have such resistance now in what has become a left-wing establishment.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a very powerful left-wing establishment in Britain. It's not just the economic establishment that's in the Treasury and the ABR. It's in all our big corporations. It's around the board table. It's in the charities and the NGOs. And that is what has to be taken on. That is what has to be taken on. That's a massive task.
Last question, can we save the West?
Of course we can and we must.
Thank you. That was Liz Truss. 10 Years to Save the West is the name of the book. It's out now. It's being serialised in the Daily Mail, Saturday, Sunday and Monday. Liz Truss, thank you for joining us.